Imagine climbing one of the highest mountains in the Western Hemisphere, somewhere above 22,000 feet, where the air is so thin that every step feels like walking through concrete and finding 3 children. Not bones, not fragments, not the scattered remnants that time usually leaves behind. 3 children sitting together, frozen so perfectly that their skin, their hair, their eyelashes, even the expression on their faces had survived completely intact across 5 centuries. No decay, no deterioration, just 3 small human beings preserved by a mountain as if time had simply forgotten to touch them. That image, that single impossible image, is where this story begins. And the more you pull at the thread, the stranger and more profound it gets. Because these weren't explorers or accident victims or people who got lost in a storm, they were placed there, deliberately, at the summit of Lulailako, a 22,110-foot volcano sitting on the border of Argentina and Chile. Someone carried 3 children to the top of the world, dressed them carefully, surrounded them with precious objects, and left them there. This happened around 1500 AD, during the height of the Inca Empire, when millions of people across South America lived under the rule of the Sapa Inca, believed to be the son of the sun god himself. The discovery was made in 1999 by a team of archaeologists, and what they found at that summit genuinely should not have been possible. Not just the preservation, though that alone is extraordinary, but everything surrounding it. The artifacts were intact, the textiles were vibrant, the food offerings had barely degraded. It was as if someone had sealed the summit like a time capsule and handed the key to the future. And in a way, maybe they had. What makes this find so layered, so genuinely different from almost any other archaeological discovery, is the way it connects things that rarely come together so cleanly. There's the archaeology, the physical evidence of objects and bodies and placement. There's the climate, because without the specific cold and dry conditions of that particular peak, at that particular altitude, none of this would exist. There's the belief system, the elaborate religious cosmology of the Inca, that made this act not just possible but sacred. And there's the empire, one of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world, that organized and funded and sanctioned what happened on that mountain. Pull any one of those threads out and the whole picture changes. But at the center of everything is a question that no amount of evidence can fully settle. What were those children's final hours like? Were they willing participants in a ceremony they believed would elevate them to divine status? Were they afraid? Did they suffer? Was this an act of devotion or something much darker? The honest answer is that we don't entirely know. We have theories, evidence, interpretations. We have the bodies themselves, which tell a staggering amount if you know how to read them. But the full truth of what those children experienced on that mountain is something the ice has only partially surrendered. So over the course of this story, we're going to climb that mountain with them. We're going to look at how a human body can survive 5 centuries of cold, what the Inca Empire actually was, and what it believed, what the physical evidence carved into their bones and hair and tissue tells scientists today, and why civilizations across the ancient world turned the peaks of mountains into altars. By the end, you'll have a completely different picture of what archaeology can actually reveal and what it can't, and why some of the most important questions about human history don't have clean answers. Before we go any further, though, I want to know where you are right now and what time it is. It genuinely fascinates me that someone might be listening to this at midnight in Buenos Aires, or on a lunch break in Tokyo, or falling asleep in Edinburgh. Drop it in the comments, I read them. Now let's go back to 1999 to a volcano in the Andes and a discovery that changed everything. Lulailako doesn't want you there. That's the first thing you need to understand about this mountain. At 22,110 feet, it sits in the Puna de Atacama, one of the highest and driest plateaus on Earth, straddling the border between Argentina and Chile, like something that hasn't decided which country it belongs to and doesn't particularly care. The air at the summit contains roughly half the oxygen available at sea level. Your body starts making mistakes up there. Your judgment gets foggy. Your fingers stop cooperating. Simple tasks, tying a knot, reading a compass, remembering what you were doing 30 seconds ago, become genuinely difficult. And the weather can shift from clear and cold to life-threatening in less time than it takes to describe it. This is what makes high mountains such extraordinary keepers of secrets. They're not hospitable to the living, which means the living rarely go there, which means whatever gets left behind tends to stay exactly where it was left. No scavengers at that altitude, no insects to accelerate decomposition, no rainfall to wash things away or freeze-thaw cycles to crack and scatter remains. Just cold, dry, still air and the slow passage of centuries. The mountain doesn't preserve things on purpose, it just makes it almost impossible for anything to change. The team that reached the summit of Lulailako in March of 1999 was led by Johan Reinhard, an archaeologist and National Geographic explorer who had spent years working at altitude across the Andes and had already made significant high-altitude discoveries in the region. He knew what these peaks sometimes held, but knowing something intellectually and confronting it physically are two completely different experiences. What they found near the summit that day was not what anyone's preparation had fully accounted for. 3 children, seated upright, together. A girl of roughly 15 who would later be called the Maiden, a boy of around 4 or 5, a younger girl of similar age. They weren't scattered, they weren't collapsed or contorted, they were placed. The positions, the arrangement, the care visible even in that first exposure told experienced researchers immediately that this wasn't an accident, wasn't a tragedy of weather or misadventure. This was intentional. Someone had brought these children to the top of one of the highest volcanoes in the world and left them there with extraordinary care. The initial shock wasn't just about the children being there, it was about what 5 centuries had and hadn't done to them. The oldest girl's face was recognizably a face, not a skull, not a mummified grimace, but an actual face, with skin that had kept its texture, lips that had kept their shape, hair that was still braided. The younger children showed the same impossible intactness. At that altitude, in those conditions, the mountain had essentially functioned as a sealed freezer, operating at a temperature that stayed consistently cold enough to arrest biological decay almost entirely. The bodies hadn't dried out and contracted the way desert mummies do. They had frozen, quietly, and stayed frozen, which is a fundamentally different preservation process and a far more complete one. Here's why that matters. Freezing stops decomposition differently than desiccation. When tissue freezes quickly and stays frozen, the cellular architecture is largely maintained. The proteins don't fully break down. The DNA stays relatively intact. The contents of the stomach can still be analysed. Hair, which grows in layers and records chemical exposures over time almost like a biological tape recorder, retains those records. What the team was looking at wasn't just 3 preserved bodies. It was 3 preserved lives, stored in extraordinary detail inside a mountain that had kept its temperature steady for 500 years. But here's where the science meets the urgency of the situation, and where things get genuinely complicated. The moment you find something like this, you're in a race against every decision you make next. The children had survived 5 centuries in stable, frozen, undisturbed conditions. The act of discovery itself began a process of change. The temperature at the site, the humidity, the exposure to air, the handling involved in documentation and eventual removal, all of it becomes a source of potential damage that simply didn't exist an hour before you arrived. What investigators could determine immediately on site was limited, and had to stay limited, because the priority was preserving the evidence intact for the controlled conditions of a laboratory. What they could establish right there, in those first hours, was substantial but incomplete. They could see the arrangement and positions of the bodies and read intentionality into the placement. They could document the presence of textile bundles, ceramic vessels, figurines, and offerings arranged around the children. They could observe that the preservation was exceptional, almost unprecedented at this level of completeness. They could make preliminary age estimates based on physical size and development. They could begin to understand the scale of what they were dealing with. What they couldn't determine on the mountain was almost everything else. The precise ages, the cause of death, whether the children had been sedated, which later analysis would suggest, what they had eaten in their final days and weeks, where they had originally come from, what their lives had looked like before the final climb. All of that was locked inside the tissue and bone and hair, waiting for laboratory conditions that didn't exist at 22,000 feet on a volcano in the Argentine Andes. The chain of custody concerns that emerged in those first hours were serious, and they were real. High-altitude discoveries of this significance had been mishandled before, sometimes catastrophically. Objects removed without proper documentation. Remains transported in ways that accelerated deterioration. contamination introduced through direct handling that corrupted later DNA analysis. Reinhard and his team understood what was at stake, and the recovery process was methodical in a way that stood in deliberate contrast to some earlier high-altitude finds. Everything was documented in place before anything was moved. The decision-making about transport was not casual. The bodies were eventually brought down and transferred to the Museum of High-Altitude Archaeology in Salta, Argentina, where they remain today, kept at a constant temperature that mimics the conditions of the summit. That detail matters. The museum didn't just put them in a standard storage room, it built a facility designed specifically to continue what the mountain had been doing for 500 years, keeping them frozen, keeping them stable, giving researchers the ability to study them without losing what the ice had preserved. What the mountain had given scientists was, in archaeological terms, almost inconceivably rare. Most of what we know about ancient civilizations comes from objects, from stone and ceramic and metal, from things that survive because they're made of materials that don't decay easily. Organic material, the actual biological record of human lives, almost never survives at the scale found on Lulailako. We don't usually get to ask what someone ate in their last weeks. We don't usually get to analyze what substances were in their bloodstream. We don't usually get to read the chemical diary written in someone's hair. The mountain handed all of that over, and wrapped inside that scientific gift was something else entirely. 3 children who had names, who had families, who had come from somewhere in an empire that stretched across thousands of miles of the most dramatic terrain on Earth. The preservation that made them so valuable to science was also the preservation that made them so impossible to look at without feeling something shift. This wasn't an abstract find. This was 3 small human beings sitting together on a summit, waiting for someone to finally come and ask what had happened to them. Here's what the mountain was actually doing to those 3 children for 500 years, and why the word preserved doesn't fully capture how strange and specific the process really is. Start with temperature. Lulailako's summit sits cold enough, consistently enough, that biological decay essentially stops. Not slows, stops. The microorganisms responsible for decomposition, the bacteria that break down soft tissue, the enzymatic processes that cause cells to self-destruct after death, all of them require a threshold of warmth to function. Drop below that threshold and keep it there, and you've interrupted the most fundamental process in nature. Things stop becoming other things. They stay what they are, but temperature is only part of the equation. The Atacama Plateau is also one of the driest places on Earth, and at high altitude the air carries almost no moisture. Low humidity matters because moisture is the other essential ingredient for microbial activity. Even bacteria that can survive cold temperatures struggle to function without water. Combined, the cold and the dryness create conditions that are almost biologically hostile to decay in any form. Add to that the oxygen levels at 22,000 feet, roughly half what you'd find at sea level, and you've removed yet another ingredient that decomposition depends on. The mountain wasn't doing anything special. It was simply maintaining an environment where the normal processes of death couldn't complete themselves. The result is something distinct from other forms of mummification, and the distinction matters enormously for what scientists can actually learn. Desert mummies are preserved through rapid desiccation. The tissue dries out fast enough that bacteria can't establish themselves, but the process is violent at the cellular level. Tissue contracts, distorts, hardens, cellular structures collapse. What you end up with is recognizable but fundamentally changed. The Lulailako children were preserved by freezing, which is a different mechanism entirely. When tissue freezes quickly and stays frozen without thawing, the cellular architecture remains largely intact. Proteins hold their structure. DNA degrades far more slowly. The contents of the digestive system, which tells you what someone ate in their final hours, remain analyzable. You're not looking at the impression of a life. You're looking at the actual biological record of one stored at the molecular level. That said, the headlines that accompanied the discovery use language that needs some pressure applied to it. Perfectly preserved is a phrase that sells newspapers and generates clicks, and it also happens to be technically misleading. What perfectly preserved means in practice is that the preservation was exceptional by any comparative standard, not that it was complete or undamaged. The oldest child, the maiden, showed the most remarkable surface preservation, but all 3 bodies carried evidence of damage that 5 centuries of high-altitude existence had accumulated despite the cold. Sun exposure at altitude is intense. UV radiation at 22,000 feet is brutal, and some surface tissue had been affected. More significantly, the summit of Lulelako is not a static environment. Freeze-thaw cycles, even subtle ones, can cause ice crystals to form and reform inside tissue, which damages cellular structures in ways that aren't visible on the surface. Ice movement within the volcanic soil can shift and stress frozen remains over decades. What looked intact from the outside wasn't necessarily pristine at the microscopic level, and researchers knew better than to assume otherwise. This is exactly why the tests used on frozen remains take the time they take. DNA analysis requires careful extraction protocols because even well-preserved ancient DNA is fragmentary, contaminated at the margins, and easily overwhelmed by modern DNA introduced through handling. Isotope analysis of bone and hair, which can reveal where someone grew up, what they ate, how their diet changed over time, requires precise laboratory conditions and multiple rounds of testing before results can be published with any confidence. Stable isotope ratios in hair can track chemical changes month by month, almost like reading a timeline backward through someone's final year, but only if the hair is handled correctly and analysed against appropriate reference samples. Textile analysis, examining the weave patterns, fibre sources and dye compounds in the clothing, requires specialised techniques that are slow and painstaking. Pathogen screening, looking for evidence of disease in preserved tissue, is even more demanding. Every one of these tests requires time, because rushing any of them risks contaminating or destroying the very evidence you're trying to read. What preservation at this level opens up is genuinely unprecedented in archaeology. Most of what we know about ancient civilizations is reconstructed from objects: stone, ceramic, metal. Materials that survive because they resist decay, not because they capture biology. The Lulelako find-handed research is something almost nobody gets to work with. The actual biological record of 3 individuals who lived within a functioning empire 500 years ago. What they ate in their final weeks. What substances were present in their systems. What diseases, if any, they had been exposed to. Where they had spent their childhoods, encoded in the isotopic signature of their bones. How their bodies had changed in the months leading up to the climb, written into the chemical layering of their hair. But here's where any honest account of this process has to hold something back, because the language of scientific certainty doesn't fully fit what frozen remains can tell you. Preservation can answer certain questions with remarkable precision. It cannot answer all of them, and some of the most important ones remain genuinely open. You can determine what someone ate. You cannot determine what they felt. You can find chemical compounds in tissue that suggest sedation. You cannot confirm the sequence of events that led to their deaths with absolute certainty. You can reconstruct a biological profile with extraordinary detail. You cannot reconstruct the intention of the people who brought them to the summit, the specific beliefs that made the act meaningful to those who performed it, or what the children themselves understood about what was happening to them. This is the particular tension that sits at the centre of finds like this one. The science grows more sophisticated every year. The tests get more precise. The resolution of the biological picture improves with every new technique applied to the samples. And still the mountain keeps certain things. The inner lives, the individual experiences, the specific meanings carried in the minds of the people who made these decisions 5 centuries ago, those don't freeze. They don't preserve. They're gone in a way that no laboratory can address. What the ice gives you is the body. What it cannot give you is the person, and the closer the science gets to one, the more acute the absence of the other becomes. 500 years sounds like a long time until you remember what else was happening on the planet at exactly that moment. When these 3 children were alive, an empire stretched along the spine of the Andes that could rival anything in the world for scale and organization. The Inca called it Tawantinsuyu, the land of 4 quarters, stitched together from Colombia down to central Chile and Argentina. Its roads ran for tens of thousands of kilometers. Its storehouses fed armies and villages. Its administrators could mobilize labor across terrain that would make modern infrastructure planners sweat. And yet, when you place those children on a timeline, they were almost modern to us and unimaginably ancient to themselves at the same time. Think sideways for a second, not just up and down the mountain. To the north, ships from Spain and Portugal are already crossing the Atlantic. In a generation or 2, Europeans will be mapping coastlines, planting crosses, and announcing that entire continents now belong to distant kings they've never seen. Printing presses are running in Europe. Gunpowder weapons exist. In some cities, clocks are ticking on church towers. The children on Lulai-Lako lived in a world that never heard a mechanical clock strike the hour, never saw an iron nail, never read a word printed on paper, and yet their world had its own absolute cutting edge. Kipu accountants tracking labour and harvests on knotted cords, terraced fields engineered to manage water and soil in microclimates, storehouses stocked against famine, a relay system of runners who could move messages faster than many medieval kingdoms ever managed. From their point of view, the empire they lived in was the centre of the world. Beyond its borders were peoples who might be enemies, allies, or future subjects, but not equals in cosmic importance. The sun watched their emperor. The mountains listened to their offerings. The order of things felt stable, meaningful, and divinely structured. And then there was the landscape itself. Mountains don't just sit in the background in the Andes. They dictate almost everything. Where you can walk, where you can plant, where you can live. A single ridge can turn a 3-day journey into a 3-week ordeal. A snow line drawn a little lower in a bad year can wipe out a harvest. In a world without engines, high passes become gates, valleys become corridors, rivers cut canyons that funnel travel in very specific directions. The road network of Tawantinsuyu didn't fight the mountains, it folded itself into them, switching back and forth along slopes, hugging contours, throwing stone staircases at impossible inclines. Every route was a negotiation with altitude, weather and rock. Those same mountains that made travel hard also made borders feel real, in a way a line on a map never could. Your community might live in one valley, separated from the next by a chain of stark ridges you could see, but rarely cross. The peak that loomed above you every morning wasn't an abstract symbol. It was the thing that decided when your streams swelled with meltwater and when they dried. It caught the clouds or failed to catch them. It threw shade on your terraces at certain times of year, changing what you could grow and where. It shouldn't be surprising that people treated those mountains as beings, not scenery. In the Andean world, nature was not an it was a who. Mountains, lakes, springs, rocks with distinctive shapes, all could be waka, sacred places or beings with presence and agency. The great peaks were appas or lords of the landscape. They could bless your fields with rain or smash them with hail. They could protect your herds from disease or send a sudden frost that killed the young animals overnight. This wasn't metaphor. For the communities living under those peaks, the mountains' moods were as real and consequential as an emperor's decree. So you didn't just use the land, you entered into a relationship with it. There were obligations. Offerings were part of that relationship. Not optional piety, but maintenance. As you would send labourers to repair a road or carriers to resupply a storehouse, you sent gifts to the beings who controlled the weather, the fertility of fields, the safety of travellers, llamas, textiles, food, chicha beer, coca leaves, and, in rare and extremely significant cases, humans. Why children? Across a lot of cultures, not just in the Andes, children occupy a very specific place in the metaphysical order. They are close to the beginning of life. In some belief systems, that means they are closer to the gods, to the ancestors, to whatever realm souls are believed to come from. They haven't accumulated the moral complications, the debts, the pollutions of adult life. If the world is full of beings with personalities and preferences, then the quality of the offering matters. You don't give your most powerful mountain an afterthought. You give something that is symbolically pure, socially precious, and cosmically noticeable. Children, especially healthy, beautiful, well-cared for children, could be understood as the most potent gifts imaginable. Not because they were disposable, but precisely because they were not. And in the world of the Lulai-Lako children, this logic of reciprocity with the natural and supernatural world was being braided together with something else. Imperial power. The Inca state did not erase local traditions. It absorbed, redirected, and reframed them. Local mountain spirits could be acknowledged as part of a larger sacred geography that ultimately centered on the emperor and the sun. Local shrines might be folded into an imperial ritual circuit. Local elites could see their own sacred places honored by the state, as long as those places and rituals also affirmed the empire's cosmic narrative. So when an important ceremony required human offerings, the decision was not just theological, it was political. Children might be selected from across the empire, sometimes from noble or high-status families, sometimes as part of tribute relationships. Being chosen could be framed as an honor that elevated the child's family and community. Their sacrifice could knit local loyalty into the imperial project. Your child becomes a messenger, a permanent intermediary at a powerful mountain on behalf of everyone. What we actually know about these systems comes from two very different kinds of evidence that don't always line up cleanly. On one side, there are the chronicles. Spanish priests and officials wrote down what they thought they were seeing, or what indigenous informants told them decades after the empire had collapsed and under conditions of conquest and conversion. Those texts describe rituals, sacrifices, festivals, and beliefs, often coloured by Christian assumptions about idolatry and sin. They give us names for ceremonies, lists of offerings, and occasionally explicit mentions of child sacrifice as a rare and extraordinary act. On the other side, there is the archaeological record. High-altitude burials like Lulailako, mountaintop platforms, offerings frozen into scree and ice, textiles, figurines, pottery, chemical traces in hair and bone. These don't come with explanations. They come with patterns, ages, health profiles, locations, repeated associations between certain kinds of offerings and certain kinds of sites. To reconstruct the world these children lived in, historians and archaeologists have to fit those two sources together, knowing that each has its distortions. The chronicles tell stories with motives behind them. The sites tell us what people did, not what they thought. Somewhere in the overlap, the ritual platforms aligned with peaks, the sacrificed llamas and children, the reports of ceremonies at high mountains, emerges the outline of a worldview in which walking a child up a volcano to leave them. There was not murder in the modern sense, but fulfillment of a terrifying, sacred obligation. That is the world that breathed around those three children long before the ice closed over them. An empire of roads and terraces and storehouses, ruled by a human sovereign and a divine son, living in conversation with mountains that were never just piles of rock, but persons whose favour you courted with the most precious things you had. When people talk about the Lulailako children, they often jump straight to the drama of the sacrifice itself, the climb, the cold, the final breath. But before they were offerings, they were just kids, and their bodies still carry the story of those earlier years. Start with something simple, age. Bones don't grow at random. In childhood, they lengthen in fairly predictable ways. Teeth erupt in a standard sequence. At Lulailako, the youngest girl was probably around 6, the boy somewhere near 8, the older girl in her early teens. That range already tells you something. These weren't infants taken because they were physically easy to move. They were old enough to have personalities, relationships, memories of home, old enough to understand, at least vaguely, that something enormous was happening to them. Then there's health. Teeth are like time-lapse photography of early life. Enamel forms in layers, and when something goes wrong, fever, malnutrition, serious stress, it leaves a mark, a faint horizontal line called an enamel hyperplasia. Too many of those, and you're looking at a childhood punctuated by crisis. The Lulailako children don't look like that. Their teeth are in remarkably good condition. Minimal decay. Little or no evidence of repeated growth disruptions. Their bones are well formed, with no obvious signs of chronic disease or long-term hunger. Even their hair, where we have it, suggests they weren't scraping by at the edge of starvation. Compared to average children in a subsistence farming community at high altitude, they look privileged. Archaeologists don't like that word, but in this context it fits. Better nutrition. Fewer early illnesses. Bodies that say, someone made sure these children had what they needed. That matters, because it hints at status. In many sacrificial systems, the victims are not the expendable. They are the exceptional. Spanish chroniclers describe Inca child offerings selected from noble lineages, or from families honoured across the empire. The skeletal evidence doesn't tell us who their parents were, but it does whisper that these kids lived lives closer to the top of the social pyramid than the bottom. Of course, even privileged childhoods can be stressful. Scientists look for those subtler pressures too. Bone can record episodes of intense deprivation in the form of stunted growth or lesions, where the body struggled to repair itself after infection. Hair can show sudden drops in protein intake or changes in diet over the months leading up to death. Microscopic analysis of the Lulailako hair shows shifts in what they were eating and drinking. Periodic increases in elite foods and substances like maize beer and coca, especially in the final year. That pattern lines up eerily well with the idea of a preparation period, months of ritualization before the final journey, when chosen children might be fed specially, moved from place to place, incorporated into a ceremonial life no one else in their community experienced. From the outside, it might have looked like honor. From the inside of a child's nervous system, it might have felt like confusion, separation, loss. Then there's the question everyone really wants answered. How did they die? Here, the bodies are both generous and maddening. You can look for broken bones, damage to the skull, trauma to the ribs. You can examine the soft tissue for signs of strangulation or suffocation, hemorrhaging in the eyes, damage to the neck, internal bleeding. You can test organs and hair for toxic substances that might indicate poisoning. On Lulailako, there are no obvious cut marks or stab wounds, no clear evidence that they were beaten to death. The state of the organs and tissues suggests they died on the mountain itself, not killed in the valley and carried up afterward. The extreme altitude and cold make exposure a prime suspect. Hypoxia, hypothermia, falling asleep in air too thin and temperatures too low, and simply never waking up. But no visible wounds is not the same as peaceful or kind. A child can be smothered without leaving marks that survive 500 years in the ice. They can be given substances that quiet them, slow their breathing, make them easier to position. They can be left alive but deeply sedated in conditions that no unprotected human can survive for long. Some chemical analyses suggest alcohol and coca played a role in their final hours, not necessarily as poisons, but as ways of altering consciousness and dulling fear. The truth is, the line between killed quickly and allowed to die slowly is thin here, and the bodies won't give us a clean answer. What they do insist on is this: absence of visible violence does not mean absence of violence. There's another layer of information folded into their bones and teeth that reaches back even further to where these children began their lives. Every place on Earth has its own chemical fingerprint. The water you drink, the plants you eat, even the dust that settles on your skin carry specific ratios of certain isotopes, versions of elements like strontium, oxygen, carbon with slightly different weights. Your body builds itself out of those atoms. Teeth especially lock in the signal of childhood environments. By drilling tiny samples from tooth enamel and bone and running them through mass spectrometers, scientists can compare those isotope ratios to maps of different Andean regions. The results from the Lulailako children suggest at least some of them did not grow up right next to that mountain. Their early years were spent elsewhere, possibly hundreds of kilometers away, before they were brought at some point into the imperial orbit that would lead them to the summit. In other words, their story is not just a local one, it's imperial. They embody the reach of Tawantinsuyu, children taken from one landscape and carried into another to serve in a ritual that was supposed to stabilize the entire cosmic order. All of this raises an uncomfortable question. How far should we go in reading their bodies? On one level, they are scientific treasures, time capsules that can answer questions about diet, disease, climate, migration, ritual. On another, they are dead children whose communities never consented to have their remains scanned, sampled, and displayed. Modern descendant communities in the Andes have very different views about what is appropriate, what is respectful, what counts as desecration. Ethical research on remains like these now requires more than just lab protocols. It means consulting with indigenous groups, limiting invasive tests, thinking carefully about what images get shared, what stories get told, and who has a say in both. It means recognizing that those tiny bones and soft preserved faces are not just data points. They are the last physical presence of people once regarded as sacred gifts to a mountain. Their bodies can tell us a lot, but they can't tell us how much of that story we are entitled to know. And if you look closely at what was placed with them, what they wore, what they were given to hold on that final ascent, you start to see another layer of meaning entirely. Clothing is one of the loudest voices in any burial, and on Lulailako it's practically shouting. The first thing that hits you is how deliberate it all is. These kids were not bundled up in whatever happened to be lying around. They were dressed. Each child wears finely made garments that, on their own, would have counted as serious wealth in the Inca world. Tunics, cloaks, shawls, belts, all constructed from high-quality textiles. And textiles in the Andes are never just fabric, they're identity cards. The Incas governed a patchwork empire of different ethnic groups, and many of those groups had distinct weaving traditions. The way you spin the yarn, tight or loose, with which direction of twist. The patterns you choose, checkered, striped, geometric. The types of dyes, deep cochineal reds from insects, yellows and browns from specific plants, rare blues and purples. Put all that together, and an expert can sometimes say, "This style looks like it comes from this valley, or these colour combinations are typical of that region." On the Lulelico children, some textile elements look very imperial, the kind of standardised state aesthetic you'd expect in garments issued or overseen by Cusco's elite. Others echo local or regional styles. That mix suggests something interesting. These kids may have been draped in a kind of layered identity. Part of them still marked by where they came from. Part of them wrapped in the visual language of the empire they were dying for. Even the dyes say something. Certain brilliant reds and finely executed patterns imply access to specialists to organise production to state-level resources. You don't get that from a small, isolated hamlet scraping by on potatoes and frostbitten quinoa. You get that from a political machine that can mobilise labour, collect tribute cloth, and redirect the best of it toward rituals at the empire's edges. Then there are the little things, the ornaments. Pinned on, braided in, placed beside them are tiny objects that, to an Inca viewer, would have been as legible as medals on a uniform. Miniature sandals, tiny figurines made of gold, silver or shell, little bags that might once have held coca leaves, hair adornments, pins and beads. Archaeologists read these in layers. Some items look clearly ritual, miniatures that mirror full-sized objects used in ceremonies, or figurines shaped like llamas and people, standing in for the real animals and humans being offered. Others whisper status, the use of precious metals, the quality of the carving, the presence of spondylus shell, which had to be brought all the way from warm Pacific waters far to the north. That kind of material doesn't just drift up a 6,700-metre volcano by accident. It points to trade networks, tribute routes, and a state willing to move sacred goods over vast distances to feed its ceremonies. But not every small object is automatically ritual just because it is in a sacrificial context. That's where we have to be careful. A hair braid tied a certain way might just be how a teenage girl in that culture wore her hair every day. A little bag might be the Inca equivalent of things you always carry when you travel. Coca for the road, maybe a charm a parent tucked in. To us, pulled out of the ice and placed under museum glass, those look like sacred props. To them, they might have been personal, comforting, even mundane. This is the core problem. We're trying to reconstruct meaning in a world we don't live in. Modern researchers have a bad habit of calling anything we don't understand ritual. Odd placement of objects, ritual. Unusual arrangement of clothes, ritual. But ritual can become a lazy category that hides our ignorance. Without knowing Inca categories, what counted as everyday, what counted as sacred, what blurred the line, we risk misreading something as ceremonial when it's really social, political, or simply practical. Clothing is practical too, and on a mountain like Lulelico, what you wear can be the difference between life and death. The footwear and layering on these children show that someone somewhere in the chain of decision-making understood cold. They have sandals with multiple layers, sometimes stuffed with material to insulate the feet from frozen rock. Their bodies are wrapped in more than one garment, underlayers closer to the skin, outer cloaks to cut the wind. They are not naked offerings left to suffer maximally. They're dressed like people who are supposed to reach the summit alive. That planning matters. It implies logistics. It implies adults who had climbed high mountains before, who knew what it would take to walk with children at extreme altitude. And it raises questions about intention. If the goal had simply been to kill these kids, you could do that in the valley. The fact that they were prepared, outfitted and escorted up into lethal thin air suggests the journey itself was part of the sacrifice. The clothing is equipment for a pilgrimage. Then we zoom in further, down to a scale you can't see with the naked eye. Stuck in the weaving, in the seams, in the folds of fabric, are microscopic residues, plant fibres, pollen grains, tiny charcoal particles, flecks of resin. Under a microscope and in a chemistry lab, those turn into clues. A certain type of plant fibre that doesn't grow on the high, barren slopes might indicate a stop in lower, more fertile valleys along the way, or origins in a different ecological zone entirely. Soot particles embedded in cloth near the mouth or nose hint at time spent around hearths or ceremonial fires shortly before death. Resins and aromatic compounds that match known incense materials suggest the children's garments were exposed to or even anointed with smoke and oils used in ritual. Even the dirt caught in sandal treads can speak. Different soils have different mineral signatures. If the dust in those soils doesn't match the immediate surroundings of the summit, it might reflect the last camps, the last villages, the last landscapes the children walked through. But again, there's a line between what the evidence says and what we make it say. A fibre from a lowland plant in a cloak is direct evidence. At some point, that cloth was in contact with that plant or with a place where it grows. Calling that contact a procession through sacred ecological zones is interpretation. Charcoal in a hem is evidence of exposure to fire. Calling that fire a purification rite is interpretation. The artifacts from Lulailako sit right on that boundary. We know, as securely as we know much of anything in archaeology, that these were not random outfits on random kids. The quality of the cloth, the style of the weaving, the set of ornaments, the careful layering and preparation, the microscopic traces of substances associated with ceremony, all of that points toward a highly structured event, rooted in Inca ideas about reciprocity with the gods and the living landscape. But the exact stories those objects told to the people who placed them, the specific emotions a mother might have felt braiding her daughter's hair one last time, or an official might have felt fastening a gold pin on a tunic, those we can only approach, never fully recover. The clothes and artifacts give us coordinates, region, trade, status, planning, probable ritual. They sketch the outlines of identity and journey. What fills those outlines, the lived meanings, is precisely what we lost with the empire that put these children on the mountain. And yet, even through that loss, the garments still guide us upward, toward the next part of the story, the climb itself. If the clothing is equipment for a pilgrimage, then somewhere below that summit, the pilgrimage had to begin. Not on the very last slope of scree and ice, but far down, where there's still grass and water and people. Inca roads ran like arteries through this landscape, paved or cobbled in places, cut into sheer hillsides, bridging ravines with stone and rope. You don't haul 3 children and a cache of precious offerings up a 6,700-metre volcano by bushwhacking. You use infrastructure. You use people. So picture the start of that climb not as a heroic solo trek, but as a small moving community. Porters carrying bundles wrapped in textiles, each one carefully tied so the contents don't spill. Priests or ritual specialists, men and maybe women, who know the prayers, the songs, the proper ways to address the mountain. Perhaps a local karaka, a community leader walking near the children representing the town or region that had given them. Maybe relatives, a mother allowed to accompany the group for a while, or kin who walk part way and then turn back when the path gets too hard. We don't have a written itinerary. What we have are patterns. On other high Andean peaks where Inca sacrifices have been found, archaeologists have traced faint paths, lines of worn stone, low walls marking switchbacks, clusters of rock cairns that function like signposts in the thin, bright air. There are staging points, small platforms, levelled areas just big enough for a few tents or windbreaks, sometimes with the remains of tiny structures, shards of pottery, charcoal, a scatter of llama bones, places where a caravan stopped, caught its breath, boiled water, made offerings, maybe slept. Lulailako shows some of the same signatures. You can follow the logic of the climb in the archaeology. Not a straight, reckless charge, but a series of controlled advances. Up to one camp, rest, acclimatise, up to the next, push a little higher, back down again if someone shows signs of sickness. Time the final ascent with a clear spell in the weather, because altitude isn't symbolic, it's physiological. At 4,000 metres, the air already holds much less oxygen than at sea level. Most healthy people feel it. Headache, fatigue, that weird sense that your legs have turned to wet sand. Go higher and the risks multiply. Nausea, dizziness, insomnia. Your heart pounding at night as your body tries to make up for the thinness of the air. Above 5,000, even people who live in the highlands can suffer. Above 6,000, you're at the edge of what the human body can handle for long. Your thinking slows, coordination falters. You can feel both sleepy and wired, hungry and nauseated, oddly euphoric or irrationally anxious, sometimes all within the same hour. These kids were not immune just because the Inca world revolved around mountains. Even if they came from high valleys, Lulailako's summit is well beyond normal living altitude. The adults in charge had to know this. They had to pace the journey so the children would still be alive and ideally conscious when they reached the top. That demands logistics. Food that doesn't spoil easily, that packs calories into small portable forms, dried meat, chunyo, freeze-dried potatoes, toasted maize, enough water or knowledge of where to find meltwater or springs on the way up. Fuel for fires in a place with no trees, which means carrying bundles of ureta or other tough resinous plants from lower slopes. Cloaks and extra wrappings for when the wind picks up and temperatures plunge even at midday. It also means timing. High mountains in the Andes have their own weather. Clear morning, clouds boiling over the ridge by noon, snow or sleet by afternoon, then a night that feels like outer space. A party moving with children can't sprint through that. They have to watch the sky, feel the wind, maybe wait out bad days at a lower camp, then seize the narrow window when the summit looks reachable. In that careful planning lurks the hardest question. What did those children know? Were they told they had been chosen for something glorious, a role that would bring honour to their families and communities? Some accounts from the early colonial period describe Capacocha children as specially selected, fated, given fine food and clothes, paraded as living offerings. To be chosen was both a gift and an irreversible fate. But children are not abstract symbols. They are consciousness moving through time. Maybe the youngest simply trusted the adults, excited and scared by the unfamiliar road, the growing cold, the strange sensation in their chest. Maybe the older girl, the one we call the maiden, understood more or suspected. Did anyone say the quiet part out loud? That they would not be coming home? We don't know if there was resistance. Coercion need not be chains and shouting. It can be social pressure, theology, the insistence that this is what the gods demand and what good families do. It can be the absence of any imaginable alternative. A child can walk willingly, step by step, into something they have not fully grasped, because every face around them says, this is right, this is necessary. As the caravan climbed, the world would have changed around them, fields and villages giving way to open grasslands, herds of llamas and alpacas thinning out, fewer birds, the air drier, harsher, plants hugging the ground, then disappearing, rock and dust and old snow, the sky darkening to a deeper blue, the sun feeling both closer and colder. Archaeology can sometimes catch this in snapshots. A piece of lowland plant fibre at a mid-altitude camp, a cache of offerings left at a subsidiary shrine partway up, as if to greet or propitiate the mountain before pushing higher, footprints of temporary architecture, a windbreak where someone huddled for the night, blackened stones where they built a last fire, burned bones from a llama killed and offered en route. But the sensory world of the children, the actual ascent unfolding inside their minds, we can only imagine in careful, limited ways. What did they hear on that mountain? The crunch of sandals on frozen gravel, the rasp of someone's breathing behind them, the murmur of prayers in Quechua or another Andean language, repeated so many times they blurred into rhythm, wind clawing at cloaks and hair, the sudden, uncanny silence when the air went still and everyone paused to look up toward a summit still impossibly far away. What did they see? Lines of people ahead and behind, the dark backs of llamas bearing loads of offerings, the jagged horizon of surrounding peaks, the world below shrinking into a hazy distant plain. Maybe, at a certain point, the feeling that there was only this path, this slope, this group of humans squeezed between a huge sky and an indifferent stone giant. Every step closer to the top was also a step away from every familiar thing they had ever known. For the adults, this was the performance of duty, of belief, of empire. For the mountain, it was one more ritual procession in a long line of them, a brief ant trail moving up its flank. For the children, it was simply the road they were on, and a horizon they were told was sacred. And at the end of that road, the trail doesn't just stop at the summit. It turns inward, into a final sequence of acts that would leave their bodies in the ice for half a millennium. That's where we go next. The idea that you would take children up into that lethal air and leave them there doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a way of seeing mountains that is very different from how most of us see them now. For the Inca and for many other highland peoples, peaks weren't just scenery. They were beings. Not like beings. Beings. In the Andes, they're called apus, Lord Mountains, Ancestor Mountains, Protective Mountains, each one with a personality, a sphere of influence, a kind of jurisdiction over weather, water, fertility, health. Apu Lulailako wasn't just a pile of rock and ice. It was an entity that could be angry or pleased, generous or withholding, and altitude mattered. The higher you went, the closer you came to where the powerful forces lived. In some traditions that meant sky gods, in others the spirits of the dead. In the Andes it's both at once, ancestors dwelling in mountain peaks, clouds and stars, controlling what happens below. So climbing up is not merely going up, it is approaching. If you grow up inside that worldview, the line between geography and theology blurs. The spring that feeds your fields comes from that glacier. The storm that wrecks your crops hits that ridge first. The avalanche that kills your cousin comes thundering down from that corniced cliff. The mountain is not symbolic of power, it is power. And in a world where survival depends on weather you cannot control, power demands relationship. Offerings are one side of that relationship, not random gifts, but what anthropologists sometimes call exchange or reciprocity. You give so that they give. You fulfill your side of the bargain so that the Apu, the sky, the ancestors will fulfill theirs. Most of the time, those offerings are modest. Coca leaves fanned out in a careful pattern. A splash of chicha poured on the ground before anyone drinks. Miniature llamas made of silver or shell. A lock of hair. A tiny figurine buried at a shrine. Things small enough to be woven into daily life. But crisis escalates everything. When rains fail and the fields crack open, when a volcano on the horizon sends up ash, when a new emperor takes the throne and needs the land itself to acknowledge his rule, when there is war, rebellion, plague, or an omen that everyone agrees is bad. In those moments, reciprocity can take on a terrifying scale. You don't just offer coca, you offer something that feels, to human minds, equivalent to what you're asking for. Health of the empire, safety of the people, favor of the gods, continuation of the world. Across mountain cultures, from the Andes to Mesoamerica to parts of the Himalaya, there are traces of this logic, that in extraordinary times the most precious thing you can give is a life. Not because life is cheap, but precisely because it is unimaginably valuable, and sometimes horribly, because a child is seen as the most potent life of all. Child sacrifice is not unique to the Inca. It's recorded in texts and skeletons in multiple ancient societies. In some places we have direct testimony, Spanish chroniclers describing capacocha ceremonies, Aztec records preserved in codices, later oral histories that remember children given to mountains or lakes. In other regions it's inferred from burials that look ritualized rather than accidental, from trauma patterns in bones, from offerings that only make sense if a death was intentional. But it is not always clear-cut. Archaeologists argue over individual cases. Was this child killed, or did they die of exposure? Is this a mass grave from disease, or a sacrificial pit? Were these burials voluntary, coercive, somewhere in between? The line between burial with honor and killing in the name of the sacred can be blurry in the material record, and there's disagreement even among experts. What is clear is that in many societies the act, whatever exactly it looked like, was framed not as murder, but as duty. Parents might be told their child had been chosen for a special role, that they would live with the gods, that their name would be remembered, that their sacrifice would bring rain or peace or prosperity to everyone they knew. Communities might see the ceremony as both terrifying and necessary, an act of collective responsibility in the face of forces they could not otherwise influence. And yet, these rituals were never only spiritual, they were also theatre. In an empire like the Incas, high mountain sacrifices did political work. Imagine being a local leader from a recently conquered region and watching your community's chosen child being honoured, purified, dressed in elite garments, and then led away to be offered at an imperial shrine far from home. It sends several messages at once. First, the emperor has a direct line to the gods and the mountains. He can ask for rain and victory and the stability of the seasons. Second, your community is now woven into that cosmic order. Your child is literally part of the imperial ritual machinery. Third, the state has the power to take the most precious thing you have and turn it into sacred capital. The procession up Lulailako is piety, yes. It is also public proof of authority. Every staging camp, every offering left on a subsidiary ridge, every rumour that spreads afterward about what was done on the summit, all of that reinforces the idea that the empire reaches from the valley floor to the stars, that there is no altitude at which its rituals do not apply. This is where it gets uncomfortable for us, because we look at 3 frozen children and we feel, Immediately the horror. We know what it is to imagine a scared 8-year-old, a teenage girl, a little boy unable to consent. Our modern moral reflex is to condemn, and that reflex is not wrong. But if we simply project our own categories, murder, cruelty, superstition, without context, we risk misunderstanding what these people thought they were doing. They were not cartoon villains. They were humans trying, within the logic available to them, to secure the future, to manage uncertainty, to hold an empire together, to appease forces they believed could destroy everything. That does not make the act less awful. It makes it more complicated, and motivations were not fixed. Within the Inca realm alone, sacrifices on one mountain might be focused on royal legitimacy, on another on stopping a drought, on another on marking a boundary or sealing an alliance. Over time, as rulers changed and crises came and went, the meanings layered and shifted. A ritual that began as a local offering to an Apu could be absorbed into imperial ideology. A ceremony that once asked for rain could be repurposed to celebrate a military victory. Even at a single site, like Lulailako, the reasons might not be singular. A response to a bad harvest, and an assertion of a new emperor's power, a gift to the mountain, and a reminder to distant provinces of who sat at the centre of the world, a plea sent upward, and a message sent outward, enacted with the same small human bodies. Those overlapping motives are what we have to keep in mind as we move closer to the summit scene itself. Because whatever the high priests and officials believed they were accomplishing with this sacrifice, whatever bargains they thought they were striking with stone and sky, the reality, up there in the thin air, came down to 3 individual lives and a set of final irreversible decisions. The mountain received its offerings, the empire performed its duty, and on that last day those abstract ideas condensed into very specific actions, in a very specific place. In hours we can now begin to reconstruct from the evidence they left behind. When archaeologists talk about reconstructing the final hours, they're not imagining a movie scene, they're reading traces. In the case of the Lulailako children, those traces are unusually generous. Frozen tissue, intact hair, preserved stomachs and lungs and nasal passages, things that, at lower altitudes, would have rotted away centuries ago. Start with something as humble as a last meal. Because the organs were preserved, researchers could examine the contents of the digestive tract. What they found wasn't random scavenging. It looked like planning. In the days and weeks before death, the children seemed to have been eating better than usual. More maize, more protein, more elite foods associated with Inca feasts. Isotopic analysis of their hair suggests a shift months earlier, from a more ordinary rural diet to something richer and more regular, the kind of food given to people under ritual preparation. But right at the end, the pattern changes again. The teenage girl's stomach held a relatively simple, modest meal, not a banquet. The younger children show similar signs, enough to keep them going on the climb, but not the heavy feasting you might expect if this were a straightforward celebration. This is where fasting enters the picture. In many high-stakes rituals around the world, people fast or restrict certain foods to purify themselves, to move from everyday life into a different state. The combination of earlier overfeeding, then apparent restraint, fits what some anthropologists think was a ceremonial sequence. Months of fattening and honouring, followed by a controlled, ritualized approach to death. Then there's what they drank. Hair doesn't just trap nutrients, it also holds chemical echoes of substances like alcohol and coca. Segment by segment, like tree rings, it can show what passed through a body over the last year or so. In the Lulailako children, those hair segments tell a story of increasing intoxication. For much of their lives, their exposure to alcohol and coca seems low. Then, in the final months, it spikes. In the weeks before death, it spikes again. Coca leaves, chewed throughout the Andes as stimulant, medicine and offering, show up in high quantities. Alcohol markers, likely from chicha, a fermented maize beer, rise as well. And crucially, the very last segments of hair, corresponding to the final days, suggest sustained or repeated intoxication rather than a single drinking event. Put alongside written accounts from the early colonial period, descriptions of Capacocha children being given coca and chicha to calm them, to make them compliant, to lift them into an altered state. Those chemical signatures look less like casual indulgence and more like deliberate dosing. Enough to dull fear. Enough to make a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old drowsy on a killing mountain. The ritual sequence that emerges from this evidence is not certain, but it is coherent. You can imagine, not as fact but as a plausible reconstruction, a procession that has been moving for days. Priests, attendants, maybe family members or local representatives. The children already altered by coca and alcohol, fed but not stuffed, wearing layered, carefully arranged textiles and headdresses. At staging sites below the summit, smaller offerings are made. Prayers are spoken, the air thins, breathing becomes work. Every step requires intention. Then, sometime in those final hours, something else happens. The weather. At over 6,700 meters, the difference between survivable and lethal can be half an hour. A clear morning can turn into a whiteout by noon. Temperatures can collapse with a passing front. Wind can drive the chill down to levels where exposed skin freezes in minutes, and even a lightly dressed, well-acclimatized adult risks hypothermia. The children weren't lightly dressed. They were wrapped, bundled, layer upon layer, plus burial structures built of stone to shelter them from the worst of the wind. That detail matters when you ask, were they meant to die there, or did they die there accidentally during a ritual journey gone wrong? If this were merely an accident, say, a group caught in a sudden storm, you might expect frantic improvisation. Bodies huddled together in a single shelter, positions that suggest collapse where they happen to fall, gear scattered, offerings unevenly placed, a sense of disorder. But what researchers actually found on Lulailako doesn't look like the aftermath of panic. Each child occupied a separate niche. Their postures were contained, not sprawled. The maiden, the adolescent girl, was seated with legs crossed, head bent slightly forward, as if asleep. The younger girl and boy were wrapped in fetal-like positions, surrounded by small offerings, figurines, miniature llamas, fine textiles, feathered adornments. Snow and ice later pressed and shifted those bodies, of course. Nothing survives half a millennium without some distortion. But even allowing for that, the arrangement reads as intentional, as if someone took time, minutes, maybe longer, to place hair, arms, cloaks, and ornaments just so. Now comes the razor's edge. It is tempting to look at that careful placement and declare, clearly this was an intentional sacrifice. They were positioned to die, but the mountain complicates that certainty. A storm could still have moved in as the final rites were being performed, trapping the party sooner than they'd planned to stay. Thin air can turn sleep into suffocation for someone not fully acclimatized, especially if sedated with coca and alcohol. You can imagine a scenario where the intent was to leave them there to die slowly in the mountain's embrace, and another where the intent was to complete a ritual, perhaps even to return, but the combined forces of altitude, intoxication, cold, and weather made survival impossible, and the bodies themselves, silent as they are, refuse to pick one script. No clear signs of violent trauma, no obvious cut marks, no spear wounds, no strangulation grooves that would settle the question one way or the other. Instead, evidence consistent with death by exposure and hypoxia. Lungs and tissues suggesting they slipped away in the cold, likely unconscious or close to it. Intoxicated, exhausted, wrapped and positioned in a place no ordinary person ever went, surrounded by offerings meant for beings that were not human. This is where archaeologists start comparing scenarios. Scenario 1, fully intentional placement to die. The children are brought, placed in sleeping or fetal positions, sedated enough not to resist, and left. The storm, if it comes, is almost beside the point. Death is already part of the plan. The weather is simply the mechanism. Scenario 2, a planned ritual sleep that turns terminal. Maybe the idea was to leave them in that heightened place, in that altered state, for a period, hours, a night, before some further action. A sudden temperature drop, a blizzard, or the thin air itself tips that balance. And when the living realize what's happening, it is too late or too dangerous to reverse. Scenario 3. A largely ceremonial ascent, with the intent of symbolic presentation rather than literal death on the summit, derailed by unpredictable mountain conditions. The careful placement becomes both an emergency burial and an offering, the best possible response in a situation spiraling out of human control. The position of a hand, the angle of a head, the pattern of ash in a burial niche, each can be read in more than one way. Reverent arrangement does not rule out crisis. Signs of exposure do not rule out religious intent. What the evidence does tell us, with unusual clarity, is this. Their final hours were not ordinary. They were prepared, physically and chemically, for something momentous. They were taken into an environment where survival was precarious even for seasoned adults. They were wrapped in the logic of empire and mountain, prayer and politics, and then left, or trapped, in a place designed to be close to the gods and far from the living. Beyond that, we deal in likelihoods, not certainties. The ice gives us fragments, last meals, last intoxicants, last postures. How those fragments fit into a single human experience minute by minute remains open, an uneasy space between scientific inference and the stories we tell to make sense of what people once chose to do on a roof of the world. Before you can say why something happened, you have to be sure when it happened. With the Lulailico children, that sounds deceptively easy. We know they're Inca. We know the Spanish invasion came in the 1530s. Put that together, and it's tempting to say, sometime in the early 1500s and move on. But archaeologists don't get to round off like that. They need more than a century. They want a decade, a reign, sometimes even a specific campaign. And to get that, they have to squeeze time out of the mountain itself. The first tool is the famous one, radiocarbon dating. Every living thing takes in carbon, including a radioactive version called carbon-14. When it dies, the clock starts. Carbon-14 decays at a steady rate, so if you measure how much is left in a piece of bone or textile, you can estimate how long it's been since it stopped exchanging carbon with the atmosphere. For something thousands of years old that works beautifully. But for the last few centuries it gets messy. The amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere hasn't been perfectly constant. Solar activity, volcanic eruptions, even the way humans have burned forests and fossil fuels have nudged that background level up and down. For very recent centuries, those wiggles are big enough that an uncorrected radiocarbon age can be off by decades. So you don't just run the numbers and read off year 1500. You calibrate. Calibration means comparing the raw radiocarbon result to independent records of carbon-14 through time. Tree rings, lake sediments, corals, where we know the exact year each layer formed. Those records form a calibration curve. Your sample's date is then matched against that curve to turn X radiocarbon years into a range of real calendar years. For the Lulailico children, that calibrated range falls in the late 15th to early 16th century, which is helpful but still broad. It tells us we're somewhere in the last flourishing of the Inca Empire, brushing up against the arrival of Europeans, but not exactly where inside that window. This is where archaeologists start stacking clocks. One clock is the textiles themselves. Inca weavers didn't work in generic styles, they worked in codes. Tunic patterns, fibre choices, dye combinations, the way borders are finished. These all change over time and can often be linked to specific periods and regions. The clothes the children wore include elite fabrics and standardized designs we know from museum pieces and colonial descriptions. Some of those styles only appear late in the empire. Another clock is artifact typology. The miniature figurines, the ceramic vessels, the metalwork buried with them, each belongs to a sequence of changing forms. Subtle differences in shape, decoration, and technique let specialists say, this type doesn't show up before around 1470, or this particular form falls out of use by the early 1500s. And then there's the paper trail, historical records. Spanish chroniclers, writing in the decades after conquest, describe Capacocha rituals being carried out under rulers like Topa Inca Yupanqui and Huayna Capac. They mention mountain sacrifices, regional campaigns, times of drought or imperial celebration when children were selected and sent to Cusco, then dispatched to high peaks as offerings. Those documents are biased, incomplete, and filtered through colonial agendas, but they still provide anchor points. If a certain kind of Capacocha ceremony is only ever mentioned under a specific ruler, and your artifacts and clothing match that kind of ceremony, the likely window narrows. So radiocarbon gives you a calibrated band. Textiles and artifacts sketch out a late imperial profile. Written accounts show when that kind of ritual was being performed on high summits. Already the children are starting to slide into place on a historical calendar. But the mountain adds its own complications. Ice doesn't just sit there politely marking time. Glaciers flow, snow accumulates and compacts, wind scours and redeposits. On Lulailico, that movement is slower near the summit than lower down, but it's not zero. A body buried in snow and frost can stay sealed for centuries, then be nudged closer to the surface as layers shift. That means there's a difference between when the children died and when the mountain was ready to reveal them. Think of it as two timelines layered together. Timeline 1, the day their hearts stopped, sometime in the late Inca period. Timeline 2, the centuries of snow, wind, sublimation, and glacial creep that gradually adjusted their exact depth beneath the surface. Radiocarbon and artifacts tell you about Timeline 1. Ice stratigraphy, reading the layers of snow and ice around the burial, helps you understand Timeline 2 and why these bodies were preserved so perfectly and exposed where they were. The biological evidence adds more clocks. DNA sequencing lets researchers ask not just when but who. When geneticists examined the Lula'i-Lako children, they weren't just looking for pathogens or ancestry, they were also looking for kinship. Shared stretches of DNA can reveal whether individuals are siblings, cousins, or unrelated children drawn from different communities. In this case, the genetic data point toward them not being close biological siblings. That fits with colonial descriptions of Capacocha, children selected from across the empire, sometimes specifically chosen for their lack of physical defects and noble or symbolically important origins, then brought together for a single ritual event. And then there are the isotopes, the same subtle chemical markers that told us about diet and intoxication, now pressed into service as a travel log. Different regions, different altitudes, even different seasons can leave distinct isotopic signatures in food and water. Those signatures get built into hair and nails, which grow steadily over months. By sampling the length of a hair strand segment by segment, scientists can see shifts, a pattern of lowland food replaced by highland food, or changes in water sources that match movement through different ecological zones. For the Lula'i-Lako children, those isotopic sequences suggest they didn't live their whole lives on one mountain. They were moved. Their diets and water sources shifted in the year or so before death, hinting at journeys, perhaps from home villages to regional centres, then to Cusco, then finally out along imperial roads toward Lula'i-Lako. Stack that against the radiocarbon dates, the clothing styles, the artifact types, and the historical accounts of how long such processions took, and a rough narrative emerges. Selected months earlier, brought into an imperial orbit, fed and prepared, then dispatched on a final journey that ended in thin air. None of these clocks is perfect. Radiocarbon dates come with ranges. Textile chronologies are always being refined by new finds. Written records are partial and politically charged. DNA can miss more distant kinship. Isotopes give probabilities, not GPS coordinates. But when you line them up, their uncertainties overlap into something surprisingly sharp. The children of Lula'i-Lako probably died within a human lifetime of the first Spaniards setting foot in Inca lands. They lived in the last generation of a world about to be overturned, taken from communities that still believed the empire and the mountains would endure. To get that picture, scientists had to become watchmakers of deep time, reading a handful of imperfect clocks and learning how to listen not just to what each one says alone, but to the rhythm they create together. Once you know when on that knife edge of history these children lived and died, a new question opens up. What, exactly, did this mountain mean to the people who climbed it, and why choose this peak, among thousands, as the place to leave 3 children to the sky? For the Inca, Lula'i-Lako wasn't just a big rock with snow on top. It was a person, a presence, a being you could anger or appease, and that way of seeing mountains is anything but unique. Across cultures, when people look up and see a summit punching into the clouds, they don't just see geology, they see a border between worlds. In Greece, Olympus became the address of the gods. In Japan, Fuji is a sacred axis, a place where gods descended and ascetics climbed to get closer to enlightenment. In the Himalaya, peaks are guarded by mountain deities, each with their own personality, likes and taboos. Closer to Lula'i-Lako in the Andes, high mountains are apus, lordly beings, often male, powerful, unpredictable, sometimes generous, sometimes catastrophic. If you're living in a landscape where your water comes from glacial melt, where storms roll in off high ridges, where avalanches and landslides can erase a village overnight, that worldview makes sense. The mountain isn't a background object. It's the thing that controls whether your fields get rain or your roof gets ripped off in a blizzard. So you treat it like a powerful neighbour. You visit, you bring gifts, you ask for favours. That's what pilgrimages and offerings really are. Structured, repeated attempts to manage a relationship with a non-human power, and archaeologically that relationship leaves a trail. On sacred mountains from Peru to Tibet you see it. Not just one big dramatic sacrifice, but layers of smaller, quieter acts. Little shrines built and rebuilt, broken pots because the offering had to be killed to transfer it to the other world, burned plant remains from ritual fires, shells from the ocean carried hundreds of miles inland, miniature figurines, woven bands, coca leaves, llama bones. Each one is a conversation. We're here, we remember you, please remember us. Those conversations can go on for centuries. Long after a particular empire collapses, local herders might still leave coca or alcohol at the same spring, still greet the same peak at sunrise with the same gesture. The political story resets. The sacred geography doesn't. That's one of the reasons Lulailako stands out. It's not just high, it's part of a network of peaks that were clearly plugged into an Andean sacred map long before and after the Inca. The empire didn't invent mountain worship. It tapped into something older and standardized it, scaled it up, turned local apus into imperial partners. But how do we know what these mountains meant to people who didn't leave written records? This is where oral tradition comes in, and where things get both tantalizing and dangerous. Stories don't fossilize the way bones do, but they do persist. Myths, songs, origin legends, place names. They can carry echoes of real events for a surprisingly long time, even as details drift. Around the Andes you get recurring themes. Children and young people chosen by the mountain. High places where the people of before went up and never came down. Peaks said to house ancestors frozen in time, or spirits who demand respect or payment. Do any of those stories refer specifically to Lulailako and the 3 children we've been talking about? There's no clean, direct, universally accepted line that says, this tale is about that burial. But the patterns match the broader Cappacotia framework almost eerily well. You have narratives about droughts or disasters that stopped only after offerings were made on a nearby summit. You have tales of imperial messengers leading chosen children away, wrapped in fine clothes, to serve the sun or the mountain forever. You have continuing practices, much smaller, non-lethal offerings, at lower shrines aligned with the same sacred peaks the Inca once climbed. So there's a serious possibility that local stories preserve a kind of blurred photograph of what once happened on Lulailako and similar mountains. Not a perfect record, but a memory of recurring rituals. Children as intermediaries, mountains as receivers, crises as triggers. The key is, you can't just grab a dramatic story and say, see, proof. That's where sensationalism creeps in. With a find as haunting as 3 frozen children, it's incredibly tempting to stitch every mysterious legend, every rumour, every ghost story onto their bodies. To claim that a specific named child in a local myth must be this specific mummy. To insist that a storm described in a 20th century tale must be the same storm that justified an Inca sacrifice 500 years ago. But that's not how evidence works. Oral traditions are living things. They change as they're told. A story about a generic child of the mountain can become a story about a particular known burial, once that burial becomes famous. Details get updated. Colonial trauma, Christian imagery, tourist expectations, all of that can seep backwards into the narrative. So researchers who work with these stories have to move carefully. They don't dismiss them as superstition, but they also don't treat them as transcripts. Instead, they look for patterns that line up with other lines of evidence. The archaeological record on mountain summits, the distribution of shrines on lower slopes, the timing of rituals described in colonial chronicles. When a story about an angry mountain demanding a child appears in multiple valleys, in slightly different forms, and when those valleys all have high peaks with Cappacocha burials on top, that convergence starts to mean something. Not this exact child, but this kind of ritual in this kind of place, over and over. And this is where sacred geography shows its staying power. Empires fall, capitals are looted, official state cults vanish within a generation, but peaks don't move, springs don't move. Certain passes and ridgelines are always going to be the routes people take. So even when the Inca state religion was dismantled, even when Catholic crosses were planted where sun temples once stood, the underlying map of meaning stayed surprisingly intact. People might now call the mountain a saint instead of an apu, or blend Christian and older prayers together, but they kept walking to the same ridges, The same caves, the same high lakes. Lulelako sits inside that continuity, first as a local sacred mountain, then as a node in an imperial network of offerings stretched across the Andes. Later as a half-remembered dangerous place, a presence you don't anger lightly, and now as an archaeological site that forces us to see all those layers at once. Understanding the mountain this way matters, because it changes how we read what happened at the summit. The 3 children weren't left nowhere. They were placed at a specific address on a sacred map that long outlived the empire that sent them there. To understand their story, we have to understand not just the peak's coordinates on a GPS, but its coordinates in a landscape of gods, spirits, and remembered rituals. And when you start looking beyond Lulelako, you realize it's not alone. Other mountains on other continents hold their own frozen stories, their own offerings to the sky. The question is, what do those parallel discoveries tell us about why humans keep climbing into the thin air to meet their gods? And what happens when science finally follows them up there? When scientists first saw the Lulelako children, they already had a mental file of other bodies that shouldn't exist anymore. Faces and fingers and hair that should have rotted away centuries earlier, but didn't. And over, the pattern is the same. Humans put people in places nature doesn't really want them. Then nature, under very specific conditions, decides to keep them. High mountains are one version of that deal. In the Andes alone, Lulelako isn't a one-off. There are other Cappacotia burials on other summits, sometimes with children, sometimes with adults, often with similar offerings. Fine textiles, miniature llamas, figurines of gold and silver, elaborate headdresses. The combination is almost formulaic. Carefully prepared bodies, ritual objects, a deliberately chosen high, cold, dry place. But if you look sideways instead of just up, you start seeing distant cousins of these children in very different landscapes. Take the ice first. In the Alps there's Ötzi, the Copper Age man found melting out of a glacier on the border of Austria and Italy. He wasn't a sacrifice in the Inca sense. He seems to have died violently, maybe ambushed, maybe caught in some conflict we can only guess at. But the pattern of preservation is eerily familiar. High altitude, cold, stable ice. A body freeze-dried by the mountain and then sealed off from bacteria for thousands of years. Clothes, tools, even the contents of his stomach preserved like a time capsule. In the Andes there are also accidental casualties of altitude. Climbers who fell into crevasses and never came out, only to reappear decades later almost untouched, their faces recognizable. Not offerings, not rituals. Just what happens when human tissue meets permanent cold. Then there are bodies saved not by ice, but by the exact opposite, dryness. In the Atacama Desert, in Egyptian tombs, in caves in the American Southwest, you get natural mummies created by air that drinks moisture out of flesh faster than bacteria can move in. Some were wrapped and buried on purpose, others just died where they fell. The skin shrinks, darkens, pulls tight over bone, but it doesn't fully disappear. Hair, clothing, internal organs can survive for millennia. And then there are the bogs. Northern Europe's peat bogs have yielded some of the most haunting preserved people on Earth. Bog bodies with skin like leather, hair still clinging to skulls, fingerprints intact. Many of them died violently. Throats cut, hands bound, bodies pinned under branches. The chemistry of the bog, cold, acidic, low oxygen, tans the body like a hide and locks it in place. So you have this strange global gallery. Ice mummies, desert mummies, bog bodies. Different continents, different cultures, different times. But if you step back, a few common threads start to emerge. One is that these bodies often sit at borders. Ötzi was found on a mountain pass that connects valleys. Bog bodies turn up in liminal zones between farmable land and wild moor. Edges of territories, boundaries between ours and out there. Some Andean sacrifices lie on peaks that mark imperial frontiers or key watershed divides. The place itself is doing double duty, physically marking a boundary, spiritually marking a doorway. Another thread is ritual deposition. Not every preserved body is an offering, far from it. But a striking number of the best preserved ones are, or at least appear to be. People are placed with care. They're accompanied by objects that aren't random trash. Weapons, food, ornaments, miniature versions of real-world goods. Even in the bogs, where the deaths look brutal, many archaeologists see patterns that suggest offerings to gods or spirits, not ordinary executions. And then there's crisis. In several traditions, the periods when these extraordinary burials cluster line up with moments of stress. Climate swings, famines, political upheaval. In the Andes, Capacotia is linked in colonial chronicles to droughts, volcanic eruptions, the death of an emperor. In Iron Age Europe, some researchers connect bog bodies to social or environmental shifts that shook existing power structures. When the world feels unstable, people seem more likely to turn to dramatic, costly gestures aimed at resetting the balance. It's tempting to take those parallels and run wild, to say, look, people sacrificed at borders during crises there and there and there, therefore Lula Illico must have been exactly X ritual for Y reason. But parallels don't give you a script, they give you questions. Comparing the Sulilico children to bog bodies or to Utsi can't tell you which specific festival their ceremony belonged to, exactly what prayers were said, whether the empire was facing a drought that year or a succession dispute. What it can do is sharpen your sense of what's plausible. If you see boundaries, offerings, and crisis clustering together in multiple places and times, then when you find a child carefully buried with rich goods on a frontier peak, you're on firmer ground asking, was this also about negotiating a border? About stabilizing a shaken world? About sending a message to both gods and humans? The same caution applies to preservation itself. Ice, bog, and desert all preserve bodies, but they do it in different ways and erase different details. Frozen tissue keeps DNA beautifully, but can damage some soft structures when ice crystals form and thaw. Bog chemistry preserves skin and hair, but dissolves bone and can scramble radiocarbon dates. Desert mummies are fantastic for textiles and tattoos, but often suffer from later human interference. So when you line these cases up side by side, you can't just treat them as interchangeable, ancient people perfectly preserved. The medium matters. It shapes what you can extract from each body, and what's gone forever. New technology has changed this picture dramatically. When Utsi was found in 1991, ancient DNA sequencing barely existed. Now we can map his genome, reconstruct his ancestry, identify the pathogens in his blood, the last meal he ate. Bog bodies that once seemed mute are being reread with CT scans, isotope analysis, microwear studies on their fingernails. The Lula Illico children have gone through similar revolutions. High-resolution imaging to see internal organs without cutting, proteomics to understand disease, chemical signatures that hint at diet and coca use in the months before their deaths. Each wave of tech peels back a layer of assumption. In the early 20th century, many bog bodies were written off as criminals, punished and dumped. Later, better dating and pattern recognition nudged that toward possible ritual victims. With improved analysis, some individuals once thought to be low-status outcasts turned out to have carefully trimmed hair, good nutrition, and valuable items, suggesting a more complex social role. Something similar has happened with high-altitude mummies. First they were curiosities, then symbols of barbaric ancient cruelty, then slowly parts of a patterned state-level ritual system. The technology didn't invent that pattern, but it helped make it visible, and it keeps forcing archaeologists to revise what they thought they knew. And yet, even with all the tools, there's a hard limit. DNA can tell you who someone was related to. Isotopes can sketch where they grew up. Pathology can hint at how they felt, what hurt, what they'd been through physically. None of that can write down the exact words whispered over them as they climbed, or the thoughts of the family who watched them go. That's the balance these global comparisons leave us with. On one side, clear signals. Humans everywhere have used dangerous edges, mountains, bogs, deserts, as stages to talk to powers they couldn't see. They've placed bodies and objects in those spaces in patterned ways, often in response to fear, change, or hope for control. On the other side, stubborn uncertainty. Each case sits inside its own language, its own cosmology, its own politics. Similarities can guide our questions, suggest that a summit burial might be more than a tragic accident, that a bog body might be more than a dumped corpse, but they don't hand us final answers. The Lulelico children are part of that larger story. They echo other frozen, tanned and dried people pulled from the edges of the world. Those echoes are powerful, but they're not a script. They're a reminder that we're listening to a chorus of ancient voices through very modern instruments, catching fragments, patterns, harmonies. And before we decide what to do with those fragments, how to study them, display them, or leave them alone, we have to ask a harder question. What do the dead owe the living, and what do the living owe the dead, when the mountain gives them back? When the mountain gives people back, it doesn't just hand us data, it hands us obligations, and that's where things get uncomfortable. For a long time, archaeology treated human remains as if they were just another category of artifact. Bones, potsherds, textiles, all material to be catalogued, measured, displayed. If a body was spectacularly preserved, that just made it more valuable as an object of study, more attractive for museums. The Lulailako children collided head-on with a world that doesn't see it that way anymore. Indigenous communities in the Andes have been very clear. These aren't specimens. They're children. They're ancestors. They're part of an ongoing relationship with the land and the spirits that inhabit it. For many people, taking them off the mountain at all was already a violation, no matter how carefully it was done or how many scientific questions it might answer. So you get this clash of imperatives. On one side, scientists and museums say, this is a once-in-history opportunity. These bodies can tell us about Inca health, diet, disease, climate, ritual, genetics. They can rewrite chapters of Andean history that the written record barely touches. If we rebury them and walk away, that knowledge is gone forever. On the other side, descendant communities say, knowledge isn't neutral. There are lines you don't cross with the dead, no matter how curious you are. There's a difference between taking a hair for DNA analysis with consent and cutting open a body that was never meant to be opened. There's a difference between careful, limited study and turning someone's child into a permanent exhibit. In some parts of the world, those arguments have already pushed law to catch up. Repatriation acts, requirements for consultation, protocols that give descendant groups veto power over certain kinds of research. The basic idea is simple. If you're going to handle other people's ancestors, they get a say. In practice, it's messy. With the Lulailako children, some indigenous leaders have supported limited, non-destructive scientific work, seeing it as a way to better understand their own past. Others have argued for reburial on the summit, or for keeping the bodies out of public view altogether. Museums have responded by building climate-controlled spaces, by rotating displays, by using replicas where possible, by consulting on rituals and language used around the exhibit. That word, consulting, is key to how ethics looks now. Instead of scientists making all the calls, you get committees, memoranda of understanding, long conversations about what's acceptable. Maybe CT scans are allowed, but no incisions. Maybe samples are taken once, then archived so you don't have to go back to the body again and again as new methods appear. Maybe images of the faces aren't used in advertising. Maybe certain ceremonies are performed before, during and after research. None of this is perfect. It's a balancing act between two truths that don't cancel each other out. Truth 1. These children are an irreplaceable scientific resource. They can answer questions no text or ruin ever will. Truth 2. They were people, with names we don't know, families we can't identify, beliefs we can only guess at, who were placed on that mountain with the expectation that they would stay there. Part of why their case hits us so hard is that double vision. When you look at their faces, it doesn't feel like the distant past. It feels like a child on a bus, or asleep in class, or dozing in the back seat on a long drive. The time gap, 5 centuries, evaporates in the presence of intact skin, braided hair, teeth that never got the chance to wear down. Preservation collapses time. It yanks the past into the present with almost no blur. That can sharpen empathy. It's much harder to shrug off a sacrifice when you're staring into the eyelashes of the person who died. It pushes us to see the Inca not as abstractions, but as humans capable of tenderness and terror in the same gesture. But it can also distort, because the more lifelike a body seems, the more we project our own emotions onto it. We imagine what it would feel like for us to be up there, or for our children. We import our assumptions about childhood, coercion, trauma, choice. We might condemn an entire civilization faster, or romanticize it harder, depending on what we need the story to do for us. Preserved doesn't just describe tissue, it describes how directly the past can talk to our feelings. And feelings are not neutral instruments of analysis. So what do these 3 children actually reveal once you try to set projection aside? They show a world where belief, power, and survival were entangled in ways that don't map neatly onto modern categories. Belief, because no one hauls children to 6,700 meters, dresses them in their finest, gives them coca and chicha, buries them with treasures, unless they think something enormous is at stake. Rain, harvest, stability of the cosmos, the health of an empire, power, because only a highly organized state can mobilize resources to send processions up volcanoes across a vast territory, select children from distant communities, and make that choice stick. Capacocha isn't just piety. It's governance written in altitude and fear and honor. Survival, because behind the pageantry is a harsh calculus. In a world of crop failure and drought and political tension, leaders reach for tools that promise control. Sacrifice is one of those tools. Pain is concentrated in a few bodies in the hope of sparing many more. You can look at that and see cruelty. You can look at it and see sincerity. Both are probably true, and we're left with questions that no scan can answer. Did these children feel chosen or doomed? Did their parents believe deeply that this was a holy honor, or did anyone whisper doubts in the dark? Did the rituals give them comfort, or did they feel only the cold? On our side of time, we carry a different set of questions. How much do we have the right to know? At what point does cutting deeper, imaging more, sampling again cross a line from understanding to violation? Who gets to decide where that line sits? The scientist, the state, the descendant, the visitor standing in front of the display? The Lulelico children force those questions into the open because they won't sink back into bone and anonymity. They stay there, on the threshold between then and now, asking us to decide what kind of relationship we want with the dead, and whatever choices we make, with them, with Utsi, with bog bodies, with every preserved person pulled from ice or peat or sand, will say as much about our own beliefs, our own power, and our own ways of surviving an unpredictable world as they do about the people we're studying. From here, there's one more step to take. We've seen what the mountain gave, what we've done with it, what we've argued over. But even with all of this, ethics, science, emotion, there are things Lulelico still refuses to give up. The final part of this story is about those silences, about what the mountain kept and what it still won't tell. For all the scans and samples and statistics, the core of the story is actually pretty simple. We know these three were Inca children, killed around 500 years ago in a Capacocha ritual. We know they were carefully prepared over months or years, fed elite diets, given coca and alcohol, dressed in clothing that shouted status. We know they didn't die in a chaotic struggle, but in sleep, in a tiny stone sanctuary at the summit of a sacred volcano. We know the Inca believed this mattered, that putting children into the hands of the mountain was supposed to hold the world together. Beyond that, everything starts to blur into probabilities and interpretations. Maybe they were the children of local elites, offered as a show of loyalty. Maybe they were chosen for beauty or lack of blemish, or because they were linked, by birth, by omen, to a particular god. Maybe their journey to the summit was filled with awe, or dread, or both. Maybe they felt honored. Maybe they felt trapped. Both can be true inside one human heart. We don't know which prayer was the last one spoken over them. We don't know the exact crisis that made someone somewhere decide, yes, now, these three. Future work might tighten the focus. Better ancient DNA could trace their kin across the empire. Micro-residue on their clothes could map the landscapes they walked through. High-resolution climate models might tell us what the sky looked like that year. Drought, frost, volcanic haze. But some things are probably sealed for good. The sound of their voices, the texture of their thoughts, the private meanings their families gave to that sacrifice. The mountain has kept those. What we're left with is this haunting arrangement. 3 children asleep in the cold, hair still braided, caught in the instant where a living moment becomes archaeology. Time frozen, waiting for us to look, but not to fully understand. If this story stayed with you, tap like so more people can find it, and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, fragile ways the past survives. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what you think we owe to people like the Lulelico children. And if you want to explore even older mysteries, the bottlenecks, extinctions, and near misses that shaped us, check out my book about prehistoric secrets at sleepytimehistory.com, where you can read more and pick up a copy.